Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line, mainly in favor of the Russians, with two counterattacks by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians continued offensive operations within the Sumy region following the recapture of Kindrativka beyond it towards the next settlements in the western parts of the Russian Sumy incursion. The Ukrainians also managed to counterattack in the direction of Torsk, keeping the town under their control for a while longer. The Russians continued offensive operations in the eastern section of the front line in the direction of Borova, as well as Lyman, as well as the Siversk section of the front line, with additional advances in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. Starting out in the south, the Russians continued offensive operations within the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, where they continued offensive operations along the fortified positions following the capture of a line of the defensive positions here to the south of Andreevka-Klesove. The Russians are now consolidating their positions to the north and to the south, gaining full control over the road that leads from Andreevka-Klesove down to Voskresenka. With this road under their control, the Russians have better connection between the northern and southern forces. Gaining control of these fortified positions is now only a matter of time, to which the Russians can advance towards Olexifa and Andreevka-Klesove to gain control over the last two settlements here along the Vovcha River line in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, following which there's only the town of Komyshovacha, and the Russians will have full control over the border area from Moravka in the north all the way down south towards the Zaporizhia region. The Russians also continue closing the pocket they created to the northwest of Olexifa, northeast of Dashna, gain control over one part after another. The Russians now almost have full control over the border area, following which they can close the pocket to gain full control over the northern flank of Dashna and continue offensive operations in the direction of Filia and Novopavlivka here in the Dnipropetrovsk region. The Ukrainians have continuously been attempting counterattacks to regain control over Dashna over the past few days, especially these past 4 days, where they're trying to regain control of it, but the Russians are still holding their positions on the outskirts of the town, preventing Ukrainian entry into it. The Ukrainians have been increasing the amount of counterattacks that they've been launching over the past month or so. This is largely due to increasing pressure by the Russians on key areas such as Pokrosk, Kupiansk, and Kościanivka. So the Ukrainians want to divert the Russian resources from these sieges and larger battles to other sectors of the front line with these counterattacks. However, as previously mentioned, the Russians use a tactic where they absorb these fights, these counterattacks, and attack them on the flanks, which allows them to deal with these counterattacks without having to request reinforcements or additional help, to which the Ukrainians are struggling to deal with these Russian advances that happen now regardless of all of their counterattack operations. In the direction of Pokrosk itself, yet another piece of geolocated footage comes from the town here to the southwest of Pokrosk, or it could be part of the city itself. Russian soldier was geolocated right here in the southwestern parts of Pokrosk, to which a pro-Russian source that has a lot of contacts with Russian soldiers spoke about how when we see these geolocations within Pokrosk, it does not mean that the Russians have managed to gain control of the area all the way up to the city and have a stable supply line to the area. There are numerous cases where Russian soldiers managed to slip by the Ukrainian defenses and then pick up positions either for reconnaissance or waiting for supplies and a stable connection to be established. They usually hide in basements within these cities and wait for support. So when the Russian soldiers detect it here, does not mean they have stable control of it. It could be that he's hiding in one of the basements doing patrols, or that he's been walking the whole distance from one of the logistical hubs of the Russians all the way towards Pokrosk to pick up some positions within the city, bypassing the Ukrainian defensive lines, because the Ukrainian defensive lines are not fully manned, so they're able to enter into the city to conduct operations behind Ukrainian lines. He even came up with an example in the Bakhmut section of the front line, where a Russian soldier managed to pass through the Ukrainian lines and hid in a basement for 3 weeks, where he was resupplied through drones. and the Ukrainians never found them despite them staying there for 3 weeks. However, we see these geolocated footages because the Ukrainians do find some of them and they strike them with drones or other equipment as they see them. So we see that the Russians are present within the city, but there is no stable connection, which is why we do not have the front line colored over the city, because if we did, it would be dishonest. The Russian soldiers are present, but do not have the stable supply lines. They do not have control over Tryanda. It's in the gray zone. The Ukrainians continuously counterattack whenever the Russians approach it, and fighting continues here in the southwestern outskirts of the city as well as the Shakhtarsky district. So fighting continues over the southern parts of Pokrosk, where the Russians are infiltrating into the city, but the main battles are taking place on the southern outskirts as the Russians are attempting to gain a foothold within the apartment complex area and establish stable supply lines into the city. The main fighting is taking place on the northern flank of the city as the Russians continue their operations to encircle it. Moving on to the Siversk section of the front line, the Russians continue their offensive operations towards the town. Now they are fighting over the trench network on the northern flank of it. The Russians are here working on the fortified positions between Serebryanka and Siversk, fighting over the high ground and the fortified positions and trench network on the northern flank of Siversk from the Serebryanka district and the direction of Kamyansk. They're working on encircling the Ukrainian fortified positions in between the two towns and gain control of the defensive line to gain supply lines across it to establish themselves on the northern flank of Siversk. We see that the defensive positions of Siversk are split into the northern and southern parts, where right here in the center there is river lines in between the Ukrainian positions and the fortified areas, to which the Russians are taking advantage of it to launch operations on the northern bank of the river line, establishing a defensive line in the southern flank, and to gain control over this fortified position from the south and combine operations from the north will allow the Russians to pincer these fortified positions, attacking them from their flanks on their weak points, and the Russians will be able to establish supply lines through Serebryanka and through Kamyansk, to which they can gain control over the fortified positions, establishing themselves on the northern flank of Siversk, and they can bypass the town by going onwards beyond it, along the railway areas and enter it from the north. And we see recent developments in the south as well, in the direction of Vienka and Ivano-Darivka. A combined push from the northern and southern flanks will push the entire town into a pincer maneuver by the Russian forces. However, on the southern flank, there are 3 sets of fortified positions the Russians need to gain control of, while in the northern flank, there is the defensive line, which the Russians are now fighting over. Further north in the direction of Torsk, the Ukrainians counterattacking the fortified positions and the road here to the northeast of Torsk. This cuts off the road yet again. The Russians have supply lines through the areas and roads in between the eastern and northern flanks, but with no control over the fish farm area and the Ukrainians counterattacking the eastern road, it is difficult for the Russians to gain control over Torsk. The Russians continue to switch up their tactics every single time they storm Torsk. However, the Ukrainians are stuck in their positions, preventing them from gaining control over important supply lines, which limits the Russian offensive capabilities. The Russians need to gain control over these areas if they want to establish control over Torsk, which is why they started attacking the southern flank to establish additional supply lines from additional angles and spreading out the Ukrainian forces even more. Time will tell if that is enough or if they need additional tactics or newer operations. In the direction of Kolodyasy, the Russians continue offensive operations within the town, getting control over the southern parts and now having control over half of it, pushing the Ukrainians back towards the fortified positions on the outskirts of the town. The Russians also made several advances to the southwest of Zelena Dolina, reaching the outskirts of Shendry-Holove and Serechne from the northern and eastern directions. At the same time, they continued offensive operations to the south of Zelena Dolina, working on the flanks of the settlements. Russians are here establishing themselves in between the Kolodyasy direction and Shendry-Holove direction to gain control over the forest lines and forest patches and develop offensive operations in the direction of Lyman itself and further down towards Novoselivka, which is the secondary supply line. Then there's the third one through the railway area in the forest patch area to the southwest. That means the Russians would need to gain full control over Drobyshevo to gain full control over the supply lines from the western flank of Lyman, but they're currently fighting over the positions near Senjerholova and Zarechne further northwest, and they are developing offensive operations towards Derilova and Novoselivka for the second road, while the third road is still safe for the Ukrainian forces. In the Borova section of the front line, the Russians continue offensive operations southwest of Losova, where they are developing offensive operations to secure the flanks of the recent advances here to the north of Borivka and Rivka. The Russians have been working on aligning the front line with the fortified positions of the Ukrainians as they continue their flanking maneuvers to reach closer towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians north of Novoplatonivka. If we go closer to the zooming in, we see that the fortified positions, some of these satellite images have been updated, which shows clear footage of these fortifications, which are situated in the forest areas. We have the dragon teeth lines. There are 2 lines of dragon teeth in these gaps, and then there are fortifications overlooking the area, some firing positions as well. So we see that this area is heavily fortified. However, attacking from the rear will bypass the dragon teeth lines, allowing the Russians to bypass those. But we do see that in the edges of these gaps, we see that there are some dragon teeth lines positioned here to the south as well, which means that the Ukrainians may have switched up these fortifications to not only be facing one direction, but to be facing both directions, which can explain why the Russian advances have slowed down once they got closer. Now that the front line is aligning on the northern flank, the Russians will likely align it a bit more along the river line and the first lines, following which they will start offensive operations towards the fortified positions, flanking them from their rear, or establishing themselves towards Borivka and Rivka, with recent advances in the direction of Selenia and that settlement as well. This will allow the Russians to align the front line on a deeper axis, which they can start offensive operations towards Novoplatonivka, align the front line of the fortified positions on a wider area, but they'll also be in a vulnerable position because the Ukrainians have fortifications on both flanks, to which the Russians would need to secure offensive operations in those directions as well. You'll see the Russians likely having a lot of forces concentrated in this direction, but there's no logistical hubs for the Russians to supply their forces, which means that these offensive operations are mainly infantry based, limiting their offensive capabilities, and therefore its conclusion is that the Russians will likely be focusing on these fortified positions, gaining control of which, allowing them to establish proper supply lines from the northern flank through the main highway. Gaining control of these fortified lines on the northern flank focuses their attention on one direction before expanding to the secondary directions, which is the direction of Borova and Shiyekivka. In the northern section of the front line, the Ukrainians continue offensive operations on the eastern flank of Kindrativka and Andrivka following the capture of both settlements. The Ukrainians are now fighting on the western outskirts of Olexifa and on the rear, trying to cut off the supply lines by flanking the settlement from the north. The Russians recently recaptured Varishina, which secures the eastern flank of Olexifa. The Ukrainians can still launch counterattacks in the direction of the area between Novomykolivka and Olexifa, but Olexifa is clearly the next target. A combined assault from the south and from the west, with offensive operations pinching the town by flanking it from the northwest and southeast, will allow them to cut off the supplies as well, which means that the Ukrainians are here working on continuously pressuring the Russian forces in areas where the defensive lines are not properly established. Without the Russians gaining full control of Yunikivka, establishing it as a logistical hub, the Russians will not be able to secure their positions here in the Sumy region. This means the Russians are now doubling down on the Yunikivka fighting to gain full control of it. This allowed them to redirect forces and establish better positions on the western flank and continue offensive operations to the second line of defense, which will redirect Ukrainian forces from the counterattack operations to defensive operations further back. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.